Hello, everybody. We're back now. You broadcast with Sangwadzispiwe Wekachidza Makumo. We welcome you again to this fantastic broadcast. And again today, I've got my friend John Masuku, and it's part 2 of talking about what it was like growing up in the townships back in the 60s and 70s. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back here on your program, Spiwe.
Thank you. Let's see if we're going to have some people following us. Yes, there's Rosalinda is hi, Rose. Hi, Spiwe. How are you doing? I'm fine, Rosie. Let's wait if we get a few more people to join us to listen to John talking to us, reminiscing about times in the 60s and 70s. We were both young people, about the same age, me and John. We went to schools which are right next to each other back in the 60s. But I know a lot of people have no idea what it was living in townships. They know about Highfields, Mbare, and all those places now, but no idea really what it was like when we were growing up. And John here is a living library, one of the very few township boys, someone who was born in the townships, grew up in the townships, and knows what it was like. And we brought him here because we'd like to share with other people so they know what it was like. Right, John?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's good to tell our own story. It's good to reminisce about some of those things you're talking about. You never know. Others may be interested in writing books, as has been done by my dear sister Joyce Makwenda, who has written quite a number of articles and books about township life.
Yes, we wrote, I was part of the Township Girls.
Township Girls, yes.
We wanted to bring back those memories that otherwise would get lost somehow, would get lost without people. But again, quite an interesting exercise that we did, and reading those books, Township Girls. It really brings me back in the 60s, what it was like in the town. But I brought you here today because I want you to talk to us about. We would like 4 things that we'd like to touch on. First and foremost, can you talk to me about, or can you talk to us about exactly what was it like back in the 60s? You remember the Depression days? We talked a little bit about it last week, but I'd like you to maybe go a bit deeper into it. What was it like in terms of conscientizing the youth in the townships so that they were aware of what was happening, the movement, the beginning of the movement? Talk to us about that.
Yes. Well, there was a lot of activity in the early 60s, a lot of mobilization, starting from the NDP days, the National Democratic Party, going into ZAPU. Those were the days, we were young and we're not really sure what was going on, but there was a lot of meetings, most of them which would be broken off by the police, and people would be stampeding all over. And you had a number of people being arrested for those meetings. I think you will remember last week we were even singing some of the songs that were very popular, like Throw Away, Nangomo, Vambana Chikerema. Those were some of the songs that would be sung at those meetings at night, at gatherings, and so forth. But again, the police were there to disrupt these meetings. So as youngsters, we didn't have that political knowledge of what this was all about, what it was leading to, until later in the years. When we look back, that's when we see that, that is when, the struggle, through nationalism, and then later through the liberation struggle was actually being waged. Some of the examples I can give you is that people, one day, they would come up with all sorts of activism. One day you would see our parents coming home carrying their shoes, simply because someone has just said, look here, let's show these guys that were serious, let's take off shoes. Then the other day, they would say, we want to remove house numbers, things like that. But of course, there were also, as we read later on, there were also disagreements with the way those things were done among the nationalist movement and so forth. But those were things that were happening, and they caused a lot of commotion. So in the 60s, when all those things were happening, there was a state of emergency. This is
Mhm.
when the nationalists were then rounded up, and the Highfield Township was surrounded by the police, and they were thrown into jail. At that time, especially in 1964, there were now two main parties, which was the former one is ZAPU, as well as the breakaway ZANU, which again was formed in Highfield in Canaan at the house, or at the former house of Mr. Ino Sinkala, and that was announced by Reverend Ndabaning Stole. So when the nationalists were rounded up, that's when there was that quietness, because these parties were banned, which meant that you were not supposed to talk about them, you were not supposed to refer to them. So there are others who were born and bred, around that time, 1964, who may have not heard much about them, because they were not talked about, except maybe through whispers, through darkness and so forth. And then people would also listen to foreign stations. They would listen, they would read newspapers like the African Daily News and so forth, just to know what was going on.
But
When they'd been banned, yes,
when those papers banned, I thought the government banned those papers because they didn't want the African population to be, raising that awareness that there's need to change.
yes, because these papers were writing about nationalist politics. This is why they were banned. And this is why even talking about some of these things was, an offense. But there were some papers and some information that could be smuggled, in the townships, and people would read, in the shadow of darkness and so forth. But obviously, as youngsters, you don't have access to that information. But here and there, you'd have that kind of interaction. And don't forget that there were also informers at that time who would inform the authorities that there are people who are assembling, and those will be arrested as well. Even visitors, during those days, it was very difficult to have visitors coming to your homes, because when you visited our home from Toko, you will be required to go and register at the police station, that we have a visitor who is going to be here for so many days and so forth. And if we did not do that, there were informers who would say, it's such a place, there's a visitor, we don't know who that person is. And the police would come in the middle of the night during those days, and they would torch your house from the middle of the road. There were those Land Rovers which had very, very bright lights. So they'll come around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., and place that light facing your house, switch it on. By the time they knock, when you wake up from your rooms, you'd think that it's morning, yet it will be those cars, and you will not be able to run to any place. And then they will start searching to say, and they'll be having a paper that shows who is supposed to be at this house, and why these other people are there, where did they come from, and parents would get problems for not reporting those people. So those were some of the things that happened during that time. And you remember, those were the times when the cities were dark. There was no public lighting. In fact, there was no electricity in the townships, and the roads were not tarred and so forth. So there was no way you would run away. And anyway, of course, you'd run away in the dark, but that searchlight would follow you, and they'll be able to pick you up and throw you into the police station.
But I was going to talk about something that I remember clearly as growing up, petrol bombs, because some of these snitches who were snitching, some of them had to suffer the consequences because people in the townships who were aware or raising awareness on conscientizing the people, and there were some snitches. I do remember some homes which were petrol bombed. Do you remember any of that?
Yes. Yes, you remember last week I talked about the home which was next to where the former president Robert Mugabe lived in Canaan, which was petrol bombed. But from what I heard from the story, it was actually somebody who had brought in the bomb, and maybe in trying to put it together, that's when it went off and the house was razed to the ground. But you remember the Chifamba family again in Highfield, they were petrol bombed. Some of them we know, we grew up with them, but the children were so hurt, by that petrol bomb, and it was a story that made the headlines and was even captured by the foreign press. Yes, you are right that all these things were happening because parties were meeting in order to conscientize people about independence, that were not independent, were under the oppression of the whites, and that we actually could liberate ourselves. So those were the days, and others had already been sent to Ghana and to Egypt and China to train. And you recall some others were arrested during those days. And again, when you're talking about the 60s, those were the days when there were discussions about the 1961 constitution. Yes, nationalists, also were divided along whether to accept that constitution or not. So all those things were uh, causing some of these meetings to take place and conscientize people as to what these changes in the constitution would bring with regards to their freedom and independence, leading to an independent Zimbabwe. So it started as far back as that time.
But then I wonder if majority of people even understood what a constitution was. What does that mean? And I don't know. I wouldn't think so because I was a little girl myself. But I wonder if the people were ready to were prepared to understand what this is all about when they were told that there's a constitution and this constitution leaves you out, and what needs to be done is we need to put pressure on the government. Were people
Yes,
aware of what the constitution is?
I think some were aware. I think in some cases it was well explained. Don't forget that during those years, again, other neighboring countries were getting their independence, like Zambia, Tanzania, Malawi, and so forth. So we started off as the Federation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland. So when the Northern Rhodesia got its independence, you know, people knew what it would mean for us when Nyasaland, which it became Malawi, also got its independence. And also, there were examples being given about countries like Ghana, which
Yes.
had got its independence earlier on. So, and there were people who were visiting some of these countries and coming back to share the stories about how the African was in charge of their own affairs in those countries. So yes, to some extent, some were aware of what it meant. But of course, there was also the propaganda that came from the local press, whereby when things were not moving well later in life in countries like Ghana, where Nkrumah being ousted, or in Nigeria when coups were taking place, or in other countries when hunger was now taking place, they took advantage of that to say, look here, this is the kind of independence that you are clamoring for. So if you allow these nationalists whom we have locked out in Wawa, Gonagudzingwa, and so forth to come up, they will mislead you into some of these things. So the propaganda machine of the colonial government was also busy at work trying to brainwash people and not to appreciate what was being done by the nationalists, and also dividing the nationalists themselves. So you could now hear more of parties opposing each other than concentrating on dealing with those who were oppressing us.
I do remember there was a radio program which was quite popular. I don't know whether popular in a positive manner, where there was was it Signoro and the, what was it called?
It
Which
was
really,
called, well, those were programs which were done by the government in order to brainwash people about, for them to forget about what was being said by the nationalists who were fighting for independence, who were advocating for independence at that time, and also with the armed struggle having started in other areas, Masvingo, Chinoi, and so forth. The program was called Padare. And then later on, there was an additional called Mumano Kudi. So they were escalated as the liberation struggle was hotting up in order to reach out into the rural areas to conscientize people against to discourage people against the supporting the liberation movement. I think you will also recall that during that time, the government also caused the manufacture of FM only radio sets, some of which was called the chief, because it would be given to the chief and his subjects to only listen to local radio, so that they would not have shortwave and medium wave, which would give them access to foreign-based stations, especially those run by the liberation movements. Those stations were beaming from Ethiopia, they were beaming from Dar es Salaam, from Angola, from Zambia, and Mozambique. So the chief or the commando radio sets, which were manufactured in the 70s, were meant just to have people being entertained by the local channels and not having an opportunity to listen to foreign stations. And I want to add that during those days, 7 o'clock news, on radio was very popular. And you knew at home that when it was 7 o'clock, you didn't make any noise because the father wanted to listen to the news. And also those without radios used to walk to the shops, and you see quite a lot of men assembled around a shop where there will be a loudspeaker, beaming a radio station, which then was the African service, listening to the local news and so forth. So they also listened to local news, and in the night, and in some secret places, they would also discuss among themselves what other news was coming from those who were advocating for independence. So we're seeing some of these things, but we're really young, as you said, Piwe, and we're not very much aware of what was taking place. But this conscientization carried on even in the 70s, which is why people later on were mobilized even by these radio stations and by the people who were moving about to then support and join the liberation struggle.
It's quite interesting listening now that's how far we came. That people used to crowd just to listen to a radio, and yet these days everybody's just like on their phone, and then you can get all the information. But that was so important because also it helped bring people together. And anybody who is a snitch really was one of those odd persons out, because people felt that they have something in common. They are fighting a common enemy, and anything else really was to dissuade the agenda which was there.
Yes, exactly. You remember last week I was telling you about our neighbor, Smart Chikumene, who was one of those mobilizers you were asking about, those who were conscientizing people. He was very, very active in the 60s, but he's one of those people who was looked after, who was being sorted by the police to be arrested for mobilizing people under NDP and ZAPU. And he sensed that and skipped the border. And the next thing, in a few weeks' time, we had him broadcasting on the ZAPU studios in Moscow. And he did that for a long time. And we understand he died during that time when Joshua Nkomo's house in Lusaka was bombed. He was one of those who was killed during that time. But for a long time, he was, broadcasting outside the country, and we could recognize that it was him. And there were others who were also outside, Gerard Swela, who ended up being the head of mass communication, was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Elias Rusike was in Zabadaya Gamanya, were in Zambia. And then we had Joseph Masugu, Javed Masugu, and Bungonye, and others were in Lusaka. And in Mozambique, you had the likes of Great Chatonga, Victor Mija, Magwaza Chimrenga and others, Chiedza Parenyatwa, so Puza Kulandebele and others were also broadcasting from there. Quite a lot of guys who later came at independence and worked at the
And
Zimbabwe
we worked
Broadcasting
with them.
Corporation.
We
And we
worked with
worked with them. Even right
yeah.
now, I'm still working with my colleague Justice Liwayo, who came from that background, is the executive producer of the TV program that I do, Economic Forum.
That's interesting. That's fantastic. Now, I want to touch on a topic which has really been a problem in this country, that of drug use among the youth. You know, it's a current issue, a current problem that really the government and all this NGO nonprofit, they're all battling to try and come up with a solution to deal with this, right? What was it like back then? I know there were social services which were available, and try to
Yes.
merge those, merge those topics together with the issue that we're having now of drug use amongst the youth.
When you
What
talk about those social services, Piwe, it is a sad state of affairs because the buildings are there and they are now so dilapidated. Nothing is happening. I think you've seen on my Facebook page, I've taken pictures of buildings like Maimsodzi Hall, which is in Mbare, which is one of those buildings where there were a lot of political activities, where even the Southern Africa and African National Congress was formed in Joshua Nkomo, elected as the first president. But besides that, there were other social activities that took place, including even helping young women to get skills for them to survive. And there were these clubs provided a lot of entertainment, a lot of activities that kept young people busy playing football, weightlifting, netball, and other forms of sport, to the extent that really drug abuse did not escalate to the levels that we see it escalating nowadays. So they were very, very helpful. And also, they were showing films, good films, like I mentioned last week, some of the popular films, The Return of Spartacus, Gladiator 7, Batman, and so forth. And the young people enjoyed going there. And there were also some musical activities that were taking place there. So there was very little abuse of drugs. Of course, here and there were some mischief makers who would be known for taking marijuana and so forth. But generally, some of the dangerous drugs that are being consumed nowadays, they were not yet there. And also, there wasn't that even the films and the activities that they were involved in was not leading them to drugs. You see, the problem nowadays, there is a lot that the youngsters are seeing in the media, are seeing on television and so forth, which is also influencing their lifestyle. But those days, I can assure you, last week we also talked about the games that we played so freely between boys and girls, like Pada, Nono, Bosca, Him, and so forth. And we did not indulge in drugs when we were playing those games. So, yeah, those social services were very, very important. And with brothers who were like mentors to us, I remember the likes of the Kandi brothers, Stranger, and the brother to Laban Kandi was very good in leading the social welfare. Simon Mapanda was one of them. Brother Dominic was also very good and was also at the swimming bath. I can mention Love Momalianga. All those were names of people we called Mkoma, brother, who we respected and who also counseled us into good behavior.
That's interesting, because I do remember when you used to go swimming at
I see it, Davis.
yeah,
Yes.
and they used to provide bathing suits for kids for like a tiki or something. You get one for a tiki, and you get. And Noah was the one who taught everybody to swim. Yeah, in Bari there, and kids started, small kids and teenagers, and everybody used to go swimming there. That I suppose there was never any time to just bum around or just getting involved in those kind of things, because they were activities for young people. And on
Yes.
Saturdays,
The,
teen days there was teen time. Kids would go at teen time. They'll go to those halls in the high density areas or in the townships to
Yes,
music and
that was
dance
a
and.
big event. You're right. You are right, Spio. Tin Time or Tin
Mhm,
Beat, it became
mhm,
quite big, where you had the bands, coming, converging. The one that was the one which used to take place at Gwanzura Stadium, where Manu Kambani was one of the
mhm,
stars during those days. In fact, I should have mentioned that before the Manu Kambanis of this world
mhm,
became the Pied Pipers and so forth, they were besides the Kanyoa we talked about last week, there were bands like OK Success, the Great
mhm.
Sounds, Safiro Madzikatire, and the Sea Cottage Queens, which were also very, very good at entertaining the crowds during those days. So they performed at Stoddart Hall, they performed at Cyril Jenks Hall and at Seke Kenneth Hall in Chitungwiza and so forth. And they entertained people with different sorts of music. These guys, you remember the days of the songs, there were a lot of guys who came around the 60s who settled in Mbare, and some returned and some didn't. You know, the group OK Success, the likes
Yes,
of
of
Joseph
course.
Kinshala and Rungoi and so forth. And those were the days when the popular songs were like Juliet. Remember Julieta,
Julieta,
Julieta, will grow up. Yeah, yeah. Those were some of the popular songs. Even the songs from South Africa, the Mautela
mhm,
Queens.
mhm.
Sipinyiwe Thokozile was very, very popular. Smanje Manje groups used to come from South Africa, led by Hamilton Valanzimande on the Smanje Manje stable, as well as Rupert Upape. And they came and performed at all these venues, and people would go there and watch. And the other thing, probably you've not yet asked about, which also preoccupied young people's minds, was football. Became very
Yes,
popular. Those were the days we even had teams coming from outside the country, like the Mufulira Wanderers, like the Sport de Praga, which ended up taking Fred Mkwesha to Portugal, Oldham Athletics, which played St. Paul's during the time of George Matanyera, who later became known, he was George Shire, actually, he was well known as George Matanyera, Jimmy Numalo, Simon Supia, and others who played at St. Paul's Msami. Yeah, and with other teams like Metal Box, with the Tornadoes, which became Chibuku Shumba and later became Black Aces. With the white team, the Kellys, which used to play in Gwanzura Stadium. You remember the Tommy Valentines and the Rob
but
Jordan, I think, and so forth. Yeah, so
the white
there was
team,
a lot of entertainment.
was it a white team? The Kellys, when wasn't that
Yes,
like?
Kellys.
Oh,
Kelly's
okay.
was white, yeah. There was Kelly's, which was all white, and then you had white people coming into the blue uniform. That's the one they liked very much. Tommy Ballantyne was one of their stars, ended up being a reporter, a sports reporter on the Herald, together with Alan Shlachwayo, who had also
Yes.
been playing for Acadia as well as Dynamos. Yeah, so yeah, and then you had Acadia United. You remember, come on, Acadia, Cookie and so forth. So again, you had a team coming from Acadia. You had the Lustanos and so forth. And the leagues by then were still separate. There was a Southern League and the Northern League until the likes of John Matzima came up with the Rhodesia National
Yes.
Football League. We would only see teams like Highlanders and Mashonaland United, which later became Zimbabwe Saints, when there were these cup matches in Harare, would be red with the Pelandaba buses bringing in Highlanders supporters and so forth.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that was the situation then. But I can tell you, football also preoccupied people's minds to a great extent. And, the league, as well as the cup matches, like the main cup matches were the BAT, the Chibuku, and the Castle Cup. Those, entertained people a great deal, especially at Gonzula Stadium. And later on, Rufaro was constructed, and then matches were played both at Gonzura and Rufaro. And to me, Spiwe, this is where I got my training and my graduation as a soccer commentator, because having grown up into that environment, when I
Mhm.
joined broadcasting, soon, as early as the 1970s, 1974, towards the end, I was already a soccer commentator when one of our commentators, Colette Bahlangani, who was doing the commentary with Jonathan Msinze, had passed on.
Mhm.
I was recruited together with Jackson Stolle, and we continued. And I did a lot of commentaries at Gwanzura as well as at Faro. But most of my experience came from my boyhood in the township, where I watched almost every match. Let me say something about watching all these matches. At times, we'll be given a few coins to go and enter. But as youngsters, we also enjoyed scaling the fence, kupoya, and save those cents. So I know some of my friends are watching this, and they
I
know
love
what we used to do, scaling the fence and giving Mr. Mchirawondo a tough time, looking after for us in the stadium when we had scaled the fence. But that was our boyhood in the township. But I can tell you, I no longer scale any fences.
I hope not. I just hope not, John. You know what, John?
Yes.
30 minutes just goes just like that. Listening to you, it almost feels like we wish we could have another 30 minutes so you can talk to us more about life in the townships. How when you were growing up, the experiences that you had, and how it's so different from now, or from what we have now and what it was when you're growing up. And I don't even know how to thank you. I don't know if you have one last word to say about you reminiscing what it was and what it is now. What do you think?
Well, I think it's different now, but what I can say about, I was giving you the example of where I grew up, which was Highfield, but I also had the opportunity of visiting Gweru. I used to visit my brother, and I was experiencing similar situations of how young people used to lead their lives there. I really enjoyed my time visiting Gweru. And on our way home, because we take the train during the holidays and go to our rural home in Philapusi, in Escotini, again, I would pass through Bulawayo, and I would also notice similar trends. So I think by and large, this life was replicated. It was similar across the board. If you were to invite someone who grew up in Makukova or who grew up in Mkoba or Ascot, they would also almost tell you similar stories because I saw them for myself when I was visiting Weru, like I said, and when I was visiting Bulawayo during it might have been short, but there are things that were quite similar when I passed through those places on my way to my rural home. So, I would like to thank you very much for having me. And really, you challenged us as boys, you township girls, by writing a book and documenting
Yes.
something about your life. And I think we should also regroup as township boys, those who are still around, and also write about some of these experiences and see how they can feed into the present and into the future in a positive way.
I think so too. Thank you so much, John. We didn't even go into you getting into broadcasting, but that doesn't matter. That was covered by on a different platform
Well, it
altogether.
has been an overtold story on the JM
Yes,
archives.
yeah, but then this is so important that we needed to hear this from none other than John Masuku. And thank you so much, everybody who was following us. I will see you again next Sunday. Or Sunday, again Saturday or Sunday. I'll see you. I'll put a promo who is coming next. But thank you so much, and to John, my friend, thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing. We are living library. If people like you go, all that will go under unheard. Nobody will hear about that. But thank you so much, and I appreciate it. And I'll see you again. As I said, I'll see you everybody next week on. I hope it's Saturday this time. But I'll see you. You stay in
Okay.
studio
Oh, okay.
a bit, okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Signing off
you.
this
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay.